Hello, everyone. We are honored to have Dr. Peter Harrison with us. Peter Harrison is a professional research fellow and the director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Queensland. Before coming to Queensland, he was a professor of science and religion and the director of Ian Ramsey Center at the University of Oxford. His expertise is intellectual history with a focus on the philosophical, scientific, and religious thought of the early modern period, and also historical and contemporary relations between science and religion. Professor Harrison's list of publications is quite daunting. Suffice it to say, he's the author of over 100 articles and book chapters, as well as 7 books, including this wonderful book, Territories of Science and Religion, which is the book we are discussing today. Peter, thank you very much for being with us.
It's a pleasure, Morteza, and hello to other people who are listening there.
Thank you. Let's start with the analogy that you start the book with. You start the book with a very interesting analogy of a war between the state of Israel and Egypt in the year 1600 to show how erroneous this idea of what you call a perennial conflict between science and religion is. So I was wondering if you could unpack that idea for us.
Sure. Look, I think the basic idea there is that our conceptions of science and religion are relatively recent. And in a sense, when we talk about there being some perennial conflict between science and religion throughout history, we must be mistaken. And we must be mistaken because the very ways of conceptualizing or dividing up our cultural territory in terms of science and religion is something that's quite Western and modern. And so the analogy works like this. While the geography that Israel currently represents was clearly there in the year 1600, rivers and cities, Jerusalem, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, and so on, they were all part of the landscape, but they were not conceptualized as part of the nation state of Israel. And neither was there a country, Egypt, although, of course, the features that now are part of the country of Egypt were there. And so the argument with relation to science and religion is that although all of the practices that we now, or the practices and beliefs that we now regard as being part of religion have been part of human histories and human cultures for a long time, the way in which we now circumscribe those and separate them out and call them something religion, understood as a set of beliefs and practices, that's quite a new idea. And similarly with science, the idea that science as a quite distinctive set of activities with its own method, conducted by individuals who we call scientists, that idea is really only a 19th century idea. Religion is a little bit earlier. I think in the 17th century, we start to get the emergence of a concept of religion and separate religions as understood as different beliefs and practices. But until you have those concepts in place, you can't really get any notion of a historical conflict between science and religion. And so what I think happens in the 19th and 20th centuries is that particular events get extrapolated back into history, and we reconstruct history in terms of unhelpful modern categories. So that's it in a nutshell, I think.
Thank you. So it's actually an application, or let's say projection of our modern conception of these two ideas onto the past frameworks, which were not really institutionalized as they are today.
That's precisely, and in a way, certainly in some of the constructions, particularly in the conflict, the understanding of science and religion in conflict, there's almost built into the concepts themselves the conditions that make for conflict. So science would typically be regarded as predicated on reason and rationality, and religion is constructed on a kind of irrational faith. And if you understand religion in those terms, as making claims about the world, but on the basis of faith or some irrational mythology, and science is also making claims about the world, but on the basis of reason and evidence, then you're going to say, well, these things are necessarily going to be in conflict. And then you construct history in terms of this ongoing conflict between science and religion, often with an underlying theme of progress And in this historical story, progress consists in the human race liberating itself from this primitive superstitious religion and moving in the direction of science. And so science and religion, not merely are they artificial constructions, but they're constructed as competing for the same intellectual territory, as it were. And so there can only be one winner in that sort of conflict. And that's part, what I'm arguing is that that's part of what's built into the definition of the categories very often.
Am I right to assume that there is a similarity between what you argue and also Stephen Jay Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria?
Look, I think yes and no. So let me say why yes. I mean, what Stephen Gould wants to suggest is that we can construct science and religion in such a way that they cover completely separate territories, and therefore it's not possible for them to come into conflict. And, you know, one standard way of saying that is, well, religion deals with the why and science deals with the how, for example. The religions deal with meaning and science deals with facts. And look, I think there's certainly something to that, but it's the problem with it is that when you run models, I mean, typically the sorts of models you get are science and religion are in conflict, or science and religion are completely independent. That's the Stephen Jay Gould view. Or science and religion have some kind of interaction or dialogue, but each of these make the assumption that there are these two things, science and religion. And I think particularly on the side of religion, what you will often find is that adherents of religious traditions will themselves say, look, I don't actually recognize my beliefs and practices as religion. There's something more than that, or something different from that. And so while I'm sympathetic to Stephen Jay Gould's idea about science and religion as not being conflict and being independent, that view still requires that we construct this thing religion and we construct this thing science. In this case, though, we construct them in ways that make them independent. And I think while that's less problematic with science, I think for many practitioners of what religion purports to represent, the concept religion is too constraining and problematic.
Thank you for the clarification on that. You also provide this archaeology of the terms religion and science, so let's say natural philosophy, and you do go back to Thomas Aquinas, who uses the Latin words religio or scientia, if I'm pronouncing them correctly.
That's right, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So I would be curious to know how the idea of religion shifted from an inner virtue into something that is an institutionalized set of propositions.
Yeah, so look, sociologists refer to the process as one of reification, which is the making an object out of something. And I think that the clearest way to see this is in what you say. If we look at the term religio, which is the Latin from which we get religion, what you find is that if we take the Christian canonical documents, there's no talk in the New Testament of religion or religio in the Latin versions in the sense that we mean it. And I think that's true for the canonical writings of the other traditions as well. So in the Quran, I suspect, and in the Hindu scriptures, there's not this notion of religion as understood as beliefs and practices. And so the traditions are more understood as ways of life that exemplify particular practices and virtues, and some propositional beliefs are part of that, but they're not distinct from the practices typically. Now there's a long complicated story there, but so tracing the frequency of various terms, I think, is revealing for how people understand what it is that they're involved in religions. And as I say, in the canonical documents, we don't find much talk of religion. So where does it come from? Well, we get this notion religio in Thomas Aquinas, our 13th century Dominican Christian thinker, who had a very profound thinker. He's borrowing essentially from Aristotle, because Aristotelian philosophy came into the West, or was reintroduced to the West partly owing to Arabic translations of Aristotle, comes back into the West and influences theological thinking. And Aquinas is attempting to bring together Christianity with Aristotelian thought, as indeed many Islamic thinkers have done. And he buys into Aristotle's conception of the virtues as inner qualities. And among the virtues, Aristotle divided them between intellectual virtues, virtues that were related to knowledge, and moral virtues, virtues that were related to activities and being a particular kind of person. And we probably don't need to know this, but Aquinas adds a third level of virtues, what he calls the supernatural virtues of faith, hope, and love. But for Aquinas, scientia is one of the virtues. So science, or scientia, is not at this time primarily a systematic form of knowledge, but rather it's the kind of virtue that the individual needs in order to gain knowledge in a systematic fashion. And through practice, through knowledge practices, we become a particular kind of person and we gain the virtue of scientia, but it's an internal property. And similarly, religio is classified not amongst the intellectual virtues, but amongst the moral virtues. And for Aquinas, it's a subset of the virtue of justice, which was one of, for Aristotle, one of the four cardinal or main virtues. But to cut a long story short, religio is a quality of the person. Piety is probably a better description, and that captures something of the Greek word that's translated religio, which is thraskaya in the New Testament, personal piety. And so, again, to cut a long story short, what happens in the modern period, in the 17th century, is that these virtues of scientia and religio are turned into objective things, bodies of knowledge. And so we get religion as a kind of body of knowledge and a set of practices, and science too as something not in here but out there, which is to say an objectifiable set of practices and beliefs and knowledge. And then those things relate to each other in a totally different way, as making competing knowledge claims and involving different sets of practices. And that's a very different understanding to seeing them as different kinds of individual virtues.
Thank you. I like that idea that you mentioned. Even some people who are religious don't necessarily subscribe their beliefs to a specific religion. I myself from Iran, and before COVID days, whenever I was in a gathering and I had a glass of wine, I got the question where I come from. I said Iran. The next question was, are you a Muslim? And I've never been a practicing Muslim myself. I used to say no, but I knew where the question comes from. So I started to introduce myself as a cultural Muslim because I guess because I thought that if I completely say no, I'm just strengthening some cliches or stereotypical images they have in their mind. But nowadays, I just don't bother and I say yes. I guess it's just to further confuse them.
Yeah, I mean, so. Look, it's a very good example. But I think Judaism is another interesting example where people will, is Judaism a religion? Is it a kind of ethnic? Is it a cultural thing? And the question can't be answered. I think the same is true for Confucianism. Is Confucianism a religion or not? Well, it doesn't quite work that way. And so we can see that these categories don't quite capture the empirical reality, I think, and this applies in a number of different cultural contexts.
When it comes to this conflict of religion and science, there are these classical emblematic examples, Galileo, Darwin, and I guess even in 20th century or in 21st century, people like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, some other people have been really influential in let's say reinforcing some of these notions, and they are not historians by any means. And I'll get to that question later on about this conflict being more solidified at the end of the 19th century through two authors that you've mentioned in the book. But I do like to shed some light on the story of Galileo or Darwin if possible. But with Darwin, I know it's a little bit more conflict because your argument alongside many other people who have argued that the church wasn't really against Galileo, but church was actually supporting the scientific community of the time. So what is the complexity of that story that you've mentioned?
Yeah, look, let me say first of all that the Galileo story is typically taken as emblematic of this historical conflict, and the factual basis for that is that Galileo is in fact put on trial by the Inquisition in 1632, and he's found guilty of, first of all, prosecuting ridiculous philosophical ideas, which is to say wrong science, and then suspicion of heresy, which is to say wrong religion. So it's interesting that there are two components to this. So Galileo was warned in 1616 by the Inquisition not to teach the Copernican model and a sun-centered model of the solar system. He wrote in dialogue form a treatise that actually made a very strong case for a sun-centered solar system, and that's really what eventually got him into trouble. And he was found guilty, and he was placed under house arrest. So that's certainly the historical truth of it. Now the question is, to what extent is this representative of a conflict between science and religion? And I think that's where we get the confusion. And I think the first thing to say is that the Copernican model had been proposed in the middle of the 15th century by Copernicus. The Catholic Church was not concerned one way or the other. It wasn't that bothered, partly because astronomy was understood as really just a way of predicting the positions of the planets. On that score, it must be said that the Catholic Church was the major sponsor of astronomical research at the time. So it had an interest in astronomy. It wasn't against astronomy, it was for astronomy. But here's the thing, when Galileo starts to think about this, the vast scientific consensus was that it was impossible that the Earth would be in motion around the sun. The physics wasn't there, but crucially, there was also observational evidence against the motion of the Earth. And without going into too much detail, one of the key problems was that we couldn't observe parallax. We couldn't observe stellar parallax, which is to say, if the Earth's in motion, the relative positions of the stars should appear to change, but they don't. So part of the point is that the thesis that Galileo was running was not strongly supported by the scientific community. There was some support. The other thing that Galileo left out of his dialogue was that there was a compromise scientific model based on the thought of Tycho Brahe, where he had the Earth in motion, the sun in motion around the Earth and the planets in motion around the sun. And that satisfied the observations just as much as Galileo's sun-centered model. It satisfied the observations without the difficulty of putting the Earth into motion, which was inconsistent with the physics. So cutting a long story short, the scientific consensus was against Galileo at this time, and there wasn't the evidence to show that Galileo was right. You know, in spite of stories about Galileo's telescope and people not looking through the telescope and so on, the church had very good scientific backing for its position. The second thing is that Galileo made the mistake of moving into the sphere of biblical interpretation and wrote a famous letter where he wanted to argue that the Bible supported his view. Now, when Galileo did that, he was moving out of the realm of science and into the realm of biblical interpretation. The Catholic Church was very touchy about people interpreting the Bible for themselves because this is what the Protestants were doing. And so Galileo, in essence, was taking it upon himself to be a theological authority. And that was a real problem. And that was why the accusation of heresy was put. So now that's a very simplified version of the story. But what that means is that this was not a conflict between science and religion. There was a conflict within the science itself about who was right, and the Catholic Church, and it mightn't have been wise to do this, but the Catholic Church backed the consensus. And interestingly, they're saying if there were strong evidence for Galileo's position, they would change their interpretation of the Bible accordingly, but there wasn't that strong evidence. Second, there was this religious question because Galileo had sought to interpret the Bible and they regarded that as dangerous. particularly given the context of the Protestant Reformation, where there was this breach in Christianity with the Protestants interpreting the Bible for themselves, and that looked like what Galileo was doing. And perhaps the last thing to say on this is that, as I said at the outset, the Catholic Church was a consistent supporter of science and had been the most obvious and conspicuous supporter of astronomical research at the time, and indeed for some centuries before and after.
Thank you. I guess the Middle Ages has been one of the most misunderstood periods of history. We're still, a lot of people are still plagued with the idea of that it was the Dark Ages, whereas Dark Ages refers to lack of enough sources to study. As a matter of fact, they were quite, in their own standards, they were quite, the religious institutions were, I guess, the centers for scholarship and research and medicine. If I'm not mistaken, modern medicine, as we know, it started in church, by the supported church. There are two key figures that you mentioned in the book, and before reading your book, I did not know that the idea of a flat earth was a fabrication. I thought that people in the Middle Ages truly believed in the idea of a flat earth. I was quite surprised to know about these two figures, John William Draper and Andrew Dickson White, whom wrote books at the end of the 19th century, and they were, I guess, the key architects of this conflict, and they propagated many misconceptions, for which some of them were sheer fabrications, as you've mentioned. For some, there was some historical evidence, but not quite, but they did not get it quite right for whatever reason. So could you maybe describe those two figures and how they were influential in propagating this conflict theory?
Sure. So I think the standard view among historians of science is that this idea of a perennial conflict is wrong, and most people attribute it to these thinkers. John William Draper, who wrote a book, The History of the Conflict Between Science and Religion, and Andrew Dickson White, The Warfare of Theology with Science in Christendom. And these were very, very influential books. They went through many different translations and influenced not merely Western thought, but also a number of Islamic countries that were attempting to secularize at the time also bought into this model of a conflict between science and religion. I should say, I don't think the conflict myth originated with them. We do see, going right back, and my own view is that the conflict myth originates in Protestant critiques of Catholicism. And to some extent, it was the Protestants who first drew attention to the Galileo affair, wanting to argue that the Catholic Church was opposed to science and progress. And that anti-Catholic view morphed into a more general thesis about a universal opposition between science and religion. And interestingly, this is still obvious. I think this is still clear in Draper's book, where he wants to say, well, actually, Catholicism is the real problem. It's not Christianity per se. But you also get the Enlightenment philosophe arguing that the church was opposed to reason and rationality. So there are precursors to this conflict story. But what we get in Draper and White, I think, are two things. First of all, the recording of a number of putative instances of conflict throughout history, some of which are completely fabricated, like the flat earth thing, and some of which, the Galileo affair, where there's a basis in truth, right? There's a basis in history. But these two books are the ones that are extremely influential. And as I say, that they were widely read, widely translated into numerous European languages. And people today, you talked about Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, and there are others, Jerry Coyne and so on. They will still refer back to Draper and White as if these guys are the cutting edge history, whereas, as I say, historians of science know these guys as perpetrators of a range of quite distorted, problematic views of history. But I think the thing is that the story they tell is one that fits with our conception of ourselves as modern rational individuals who have left behind religious superstition. So I think why the conflict myth and the books of these two guys are so influential is that they actually match our own sense of our superiority to our predecessors in the past who were mired in religious superstition and irrationality. And I think that's part of the explanation for why this myth is so difficult to destroy, because it just buys into this notion of progress that we find congenial.
And I think in chapter 5 of your book, you have rightly mentioned that when science was became more utilitarian, and it was measured in terms of progress was measured in terms of its usefulness, and that's where religion was put at a disadvantage. And maybe it was a background maybe for some of these myths about this conflict.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, please go on, Arif.
Look, I was just going to say it's very interesting if you look in, say, a figure like Thomas Aquinas. His word for progress is profectus, and what progress means in the pre-modern period is a perfection of work on the self, that you're doing some kind of work on yourself, some kind of formation, and that progress is personal, and that maps onto the notions of scientia and religio as virtues. But when we get into the modern period, progress is understood in terms of something that's out there, happening out there, an accumulation of knowledge, the growth of technology, and all of those kinds of things, which are not bad in themselves, but it's a very different conception of what it is that progress consists in. And as you say, that then gives us a utilitarian understanding where progress is measured in terms of material, technological usefulness. And religion then, the question is, what has religion got to offer? Well, on the previous model, if you understand progress in terms of personal formation, quite a lot. On a utilitarian model, well, not so much.
I guess this is what has also plagued humanities, because I know you've also written a lot about the value of humanities and this idea of utilitarian uses of science versus humanities, and especially it's very bold in Australia as well. This is what has put humanities at a disadvantage.
This is my theory, that secularization and utilitarianism, and as you rightly said, you see it in our government, who thinks that the university education is purely about graduates being job ready. Now, I in fact think that the humanities does make people job ready, but it's more than that, and it's not simply about material utility and usefulness. It's also about cultural values and preserving aspects of our culture, and also producing certain kinds of people. And I think the humanities does that in a way that science and engineering cannot.
I'm curious to know that when you put forth your arguments, because you do say that science has a religious origin, as you have rightly argued in the book, with the institution of the church, where you met with, and also early scientists such as Isaac Newton or Richard Boyle, they clearly in their writings point out that natural philosophy is connected with theology. So when you make that argument that there is, without religion, science as we know it today wouldn't exist, were you met with any criticism or backlash among scholars?
Criticism and backlash is probably too strong. But look, I think you've probably stated the thesis more strongly than I would. And I think that I would say that look, let's just flat back and ask that big question. You get scientific cultures in all kinds of places, times and places. What's distinctive about the West is that science consolidates and becomes the central aspect of the culture. And so the interesting historical question for me is, well, why does that happen in the West when it does? And I think religious factors are part of that. Now, I don't think religious factors are the whole story. And my argument would be that I think they're kind of necessary, but they're not sufficient. And part of their necessity goes to it's the motivations of the individual scientists. And you mentioned, Boyle and Newton, who say that at Kepler, they're motivated by religious concerns. The assumptions of science that are religious, which is to do with the theological conception of laws of nature, which again, Boyle and Newton are very strong on, and Descartes originates this idea. And then crucially, what gives science its permanence initially is this religious, what I call religious legitimation. You see that in someone like Francis Bacon, who wants to argue that we should pursue science because it's a religious activity that helps us restore our control over a fallen world. And that's a very strong argument in the 17th century. And the other strong theological argument is that by studying nature, we're studying God's creation and we learn more about him. And those theological impulses were very important when science is getting up and running. Now, however, clearly we don't need those for science anymore because science is justified on these utilitarian grounds. But to establish the utilitarian principles in the first place, and this we see very clearly in someone like Francis Bacon, you initially have an appeal to theological conceptions to say, we need these useful things because they are, Bacon will say this explicitly, they're an exemplification of Christian charity and our duties to our neighbours, and that's why we need to get in. And that, you can see the argument with medicine and technology and the benefits that come initially then justified in terms of Christian charity, and in the bigger picture for someone like Francis Bacon, justified by a re-establishing of control over nature that human beings lost with the fall. And they are really crucial for getting science up and running. So look, to come back to your question, look, I think many people would be skeptical about the claim that we wouldn't have any science had there not been these religious considerations. My argument would be that science would not have the same form it has, nor the cultural authority, had it not been back in the 17th, 18th, and even in the 19th century to some extent, these religious considerations playing a central role.
Thank you for that clarification. Just out of curiosity, when you research, because you did mention this point that science sort of became an institution in the West, but it never happened in the for example, Islamic world in the medieval ages, where they did have access to a lot of they were really very much engaged in the scientific debates, but science never became what it is in the West, in those countries. I don't know if you've come across if you have researched that area, or you've come across any reason why that is so.
Look, the short answer is that, like most things in history, it's overdetermined, which is to say there are going to be many reasons for this. So what I think is interesting is that the West is behind, in the Middle Ages, the West is behind the pack. Islamic, the Arabic culture is where a lot of the scientific activity is happening. China is well ahead in terms of its technology. So the question, the comparative question, I think, is, well, why do we get this distinctive thing in the West? And that's why I said I think it's the consolidation and permanence that's important. And what I think, so one version of this story is we have boom-bust cycles of science, but that stops with the 17th century scientific revolution. And what happens in other cultures is, I think there are material factors, and that gives us an explanation. I think part of the explanation for what happens in these Arabic cultures is it's not to do with ideas per se, but it's to do with the material conditions and what actually the history in other detail. But the other thing we can say is, and this is, I think that's certainly the case for Chinese culture, that the society gets other priorities. And the priorities, to put it in very crude forms, they would privilege the humanity, to put it in our own modern terms, they privilege the humanities over the sciences, and that they think that cultivation of particular cultural attributes is more important than crass utilitarian science. That's overstating the case. And so what we tend to take these values for granted, but what you see in cross-cultural comparisons is that other societies value other things. So it's not that they couldn't do science if they wanted to. They wanted to do something else. They wanted to prioritize other things. And so that's also part of the story. So I think your question is a really interesting one, because it helps us isolate the relevant variables when we do these comparisons. But there are lots and lots of different variables. And I wouldn't say religion is the only thing, because there's other things going on, but I do think it's one of the important ones.
Thank you. And as a last question, you are a historian of science and religion. And the world is becoming more and more secular, of course, and this with the current pandemic, there was again some renewed discussions or debates whether religion is necessary or whether religion will ever go away. And when vaccine was developed, many people heralded that as another triumph of science over humanities or religion or anything that is in that territory. But do you think religion will ever go away, or if the current pandemic has exacerbated the legitimacy of religion in general?
Look, yeah, it's an interesting question. Essentially it's about the secularization thesis, is that religion is kind of doomed to die out, essentially as societies modernize. And the pattern I think we've seen is that that's not the case. That just, so empirically, if we look at places other than, say, Australia, New Zealand, and Northern Europe, we don't see a strong, obvious pattern of secularization. In fact, what we see in some places, say Turkey or India or Egypt, we see that places that were once secular have reverted, for better or worse, have reverted to much more. So I don't think we can say there's a distinctive historical pattern that sees us all heading in the direction of secularization. As to your question about COVID, let's make this point. You know, the speed at which people were able to develop vaccines was a remarkable scientific achievement, just an astonishing scientific achievement, which is great. On the other hand, I think what we see in crises like this is that people look for what makes life meaningful. And science and technology, frankly, I think are not the kinds of things that make life meaningful. And so when people are faced with death and tragedy, they don't get any comfort from science. Now, this might sound like a kind of Marxist notion of religion as the opiate of the people, but there's a kind of truth to that Marxian view. And I'm not, so I think religion does function in that way. And it functions in that way, irrespective of whether on questions, we can leave aside questions of truth. But I think while people are still seeking for ultimate meaning in life, religions will never go away, because that's really their ballpark. That's the space that they play into. And science is unable to give us answers to those questions. It can provide us with these wonderful vaccines, but it can't help us deal with death and grief, and it can't help us make sense of tragedies in the way that religions seek to do. And for that reason, I think that the secularization thesis that says religions are destined to die out and to be replaced by science is probably wrong. The evidence suggests that, but the logic also suggests that, because science and religion to some extent do rather different things, which takes us back to your point about Stephen Jay Gould, which I think is partly on the right track, although there's a significant overlap.
Thank you very much. And I just was reminded of the fact that even in America, Australia, New Zealand, or North Europe, true that people are becoming more and more secular, but there seems to be this pattern of New Age spirituality or return to Buddhism or Sufism, with the religious elements being erased from that. So it's still a kind of a spirituality without religiosity there involved, I guess.
No, that's exactly, and there's this term spirituality it's a kind of catch-all phrase, but people may not wish to identify with any organized historical religion, but nonetheless, as you rightly say, these kinds of things, you know, people getting into yoga and, as you say, spirituality and so on, the New Age is just an indication that the desire for answers to those perennial questions just hasn't gone away, and it's answered in slightly different ways from traditional religion.
Dr. Peter Harrison, thank you very much for this wonderful conversation and for your time.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, Mateza.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
You too.
Bye.